Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, Val's offer does little to improve Meridia's mood after she's been sentenced to the docks by the hate-fueled High Commander Jossun. But the wolf would never give up, and neither will Meridia. So what's next for our fiery-haired, fiery-tempered Light Corpsman? Find out next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 13. Under the Table. Meridia. The seventh day of winter. Late evening. Usually, the homey, vaguely grimy atmosphere of the Salty Lass was enough to set Meridia right at ease. But that evening, even the gritty charm of the dockside dive bar, which was free of Mandarians for the moment thanks to the shuttered windows and doors, still wasn't enough to quell her frustration. Meridia had had a new assistant assigned that morning. A snidey older man who could have been Jossun's brother, only dried out and angrier. When she'd returned from her morning run, there he'd been, slimy mustache glistening, smelling faintly of smoke and alcohol, and just ratty enough to somehow be noticeably out of uniform without breaking any specific rules. He'd thumped a packet into her chest before she could say anything, and then settled in on her porch to smoke a big, acrid-smelling Firolo while she went and opened it. And, with a few words on paper, that was that. An official order that Wells was to be her new executive assistant. Help organize her schedule and be at her beck and call throughout her new assignment. That was her new bullshit assignment from that motherfucker Jossun, who had drowned her in busy work just to get her out of the way. The papers laid out precious little about Wells, other than his rank, and her new schedule, and 2 sentences of orders, reading only, check all the paperwork coming in, then check it twice. Meridia growled, downing half of the pungent crosses she was sipping at the Salty Lass in one gulp as she remembered the rest of the morning, which had somehow been even more aggravating than how the day had started. Wells had followed, nagged, needled, commanded, whatever it was right to call it. He had been vocal and stepped as far as he possibly could, all to make sure that she knew who was now in charge, despite the insulting difference in rank between them. He was never insubordinate, but he was always there making suggestions that dripped with derision as he consulted her to go down to the docks, guiding her eventually to a small shack on the shores of the construction zone, piled high with documents. If Wells and his visible distaste for Meridia hadn't been a clear enough signal that Jossun hated her, the shack was drafty and wet, with a leaky ceiling in 3 places that had already managed to ruin a stack of shipping manifests and reports. Further evidence that this vitally important task was just all a bunch of bullshit. Meridia had taken 3 different forays out of the shack, the first for the call of nature and the second 2 just to test, and confirmed that Wells was watching her. Each time she'd stepped out of the office, Wells had appeared seemingly from nowhere and suggested once more that she get back to work, reminding her that he admired how vitally important she was to the commander. And then, even that facade of trying to be somewhat vaguely passive-aggressively subservient hadn't really lasted long. The 3rd time she'd left the command post, Wells had appeared with whiskey on his breath that he didn't even try to hide, and just flat-out muttered to her that she was a stupid bitch and needed to learn her fucking lesson. Drinking the rest of the crassa, Meridia shuddered and wiped the residue off of her upper lip. Was this where she was now? Was this why she'd sworn her life as a member of the Light Corps? To be treated like garbage by drunk nobodies on the orders of a vengeful prick in high command? As Greta came by again, Meridia considered ordering a beer or something stronger. It wasn't like she'd never had a drink before, and she'd be damned if she hadn't earned a little bit of time to cheat and reward herself. After all, it wasn't like she was going to need to be at her physical peak sitting down at the docks. No, fuck that. The wolf would never give up, no matter what. Meridia ordered another crassa, grateful that they even had some. The blockades weren't just hitting the old city hard. They were hitting the new city too, and uncertainty had swept all across Edera, not just in Reen. News was still racing around the country, shedding light on the attacks, and it was all unclear, even with the reports that they got in command. 8 towns and cities, each one with their own tragedy hitting all at once, and to underscore it all, a strange silence from Sunsettin. No Edoran had forgotten the early days of the war before Apostolos arrived, and now Meridia felt the same uncertainty, even from the heavy tone of the conversation in the bar. There were parts of the world, like Reen, that had remained untouched during the war, but not everybody had spent the past 7 years safe, and no one had come out of the war unscathed. Who knew where the fighting might one day spark up again? It might be here, as easily as anywhere else. Part of Meridia wanted to scream with all of her might and shatter the tankard of Krasa against the wall. She had joined the Light Corps to make a difference, to follow in the footsteps of the Iron Wolf, not to sit under the shadow of some fucking asshole. With a gentle sip, Meridia settled back into her chair. As frustrating as it was to toll away on the docks, Meridia had not given up either. Hidden among the mountains of manifests and records, Meridia had slowly, delicately begun to piece together the forces moving in Reen. Imports, exports, men on the way in, men on the way out. Goods, money, vessels, all flowing in and out of the river each day, and none of it quite added up. There was money missing. There were men arriving on one page that disappeared by the next, and goods that seemed to vanish and appear out of thin air. It could have been the result of shoddy bookkeeping, but if there was one thing that you could trust an Edoran clerk for, it was to be neurotically, obsessively organized and accurate. After all, if you heard the clerks tell it, that was all that separated them from the savage Freelanders. Any discrepancy would have been noted, identified, and quarantined like it was the Severin Plague itself. No, they were hiding something in Reen. And from how much of it all circled around High Command, Jossun knew. Now, why Jossun had put her so close to the source of so much data didn't quite make sense. Didn't Jossun know Meridia's past? Didn't he know she had a reputation? She hadn't just been a fighter. She had been one of the top investigative officers in the nation when she had been stationed in Mandus. Meridia was used to being underestimated and thought lesser of, but still, she would have to proceed carefully as she uncovered Reen's mysteries. After all these little trails and leads might have been no more than a piece of cheese leading her to a knife in the back. Or maybe Jossun was exactly who he said he was. A hateful man who saw no more worth in Meridia than a cart with square wheels, and found absolutely no threat putting her in front of all that information. Fine. She would take any advantage she could get and make sure Jossun regretted it. Just then, Greta reappeared with a frothing beer, which she put in the seat across from Meridia. I appreciate the thought, Greta, Meridia said. I have had a hell of a day, but you know I don't drink. Oh, this ain't for you, love, Greta said. A real looker was asking about you and inquired if I thought you'd mind a little company. Really, Greta? Meridia asked. How many times are you gonna do this? Until you get a nice gentleman to help you pound the stress out of your life, Greta answered. I'm doing just fine myself, thank you very much, Meridia said, swiping out a leg at Greta. Greta skillfully stepped away with a knowing look. I know that you're doing well for yourself, Greta said, and that's always the best time to add a little bit of man to your life, when you're strong enough to handle it. Oh, woof, even you might have a hard time handling this one. Greta, what are you talking about? Greta bit her lip and nodded to herself. Well, let's just say that I'm being a real great friend giving you a first bite of the berry, Greta said. Though, I can't say how long I'll be stepping aside. If you want 'em, you can have 'em, Greta, Meridia said. Oh, believe me, he made it very clear he wanted to speak to you, Greta said. I've already started my moves, but you gotta make your play and let it play out first. Greta, I already told you I'm not going to... The older woman was already heading away with a sly smile on her face. Ugh, whatever. Shaking her head, Meridia sighed and sipped her crassa, eyes on the beer across from her. Greta was wonderful in almost every possible way, but she had a tendency to play matchmaker a bit more than Meridia preferred. There were footsteps next to her, and with a sigh, Meridia launched into a familiar spiel. Look, whatever you thinking is going to happen, it's not, Meridia said. I'm sure Greta would like a slab of your man meat or whatever she usually says, so the world's probably going to be a better place if you just grab your beer and keep walking. But I made the whole trip here just to see you, a gruff voice answered, walking past her to sit calmly in the seat across from her in the small booth. Would be a shame not to at least sit down and finish my beer, right? He had his hair cut short. It wasn't quite so high and tight as an enlisted man's crew cut, but it was still much cleaner than the long, shaggy ponytail he'd had when they'd fought. He'd also trimmed his beard down to a thin layer of stubble around a goatee. It might have been enough to confuse someone going off of the wanted posters, but it wasn't enough to fool Meridia. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edera and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.